thanks to Jerry for the invitation. And I'm delighted to give a little talk about Sable Island this evening. And of course, some of you know already, I actually invited my dad, VE1RK, Doug Rawle, to join this evening because he had made trips to Sable Island even before I did. And I thought he might have an interesting comment on some of the early activities there. So my talk this evening is actually about my work with Father Bill Lonc from St. Mary's University when I was an undergraduate student, mostly on Sable Island, but the work actually started in approximately 1979, and I'll get to that in a little while. And then to answer Jerry's question, so my Canadian call sign is VE1 Alpha Whiskey Sierra, and I got that call sign in 1973, and I am the original holder. I emigrated to the U.S. in the mid-90s, and 10 years ago became a U.S. citizen. So I have both the Canadian and U.S. call signs now. Alpha Charlie 1 Alpha Echo is my U.S. call sign. VE1AWS is my Canadian call sign. So when I visit my folks in Nova Scotia, and Dad is connected from Berwick, Nova Scotia in the Annapolis Valley, I get to use my Canadian call sign upon occasion. So it's a good thing. So I wanted to start the talk this evening by giving you for those who may not know, but I'm sure almost everybody does know where Sable Island is. So you can see that Sable Island, I think my cursor can show you. So Fredericton is up over here, and Moncton, of course, and Halifax down here. And Sable Island is actually a sandbar about 22 miles long and a mile wide on the edge of the continental shelf, approximately 90 miles south of St. Peter's and approximately 160 miles due east of Halifax in this little portion here. Now, in the mid-70s or mid to late 70s, there was a lot of interest in Sable Island because of all the oil activity around the Rowan Gorilla and others such. The jackup rigs were all around there. And the local communications companies were looking for some way of cashing in on the increased bandwidth requirements previous to any sort of satellite network and whatnot. A lot of the traffic was still being transferred by HF radio telephone 2182 and the working channels, even before between Halifax Radio and the rigs. And for many years, of course, there's been an upper air station at Sable, and they would generally talk to the mainland on 2294, I think it was, but it was all MFRT. So around 1977, 78, at the time, I guess they still call it Maritime Telephone and Telegraph, became interested in establishing a VHF radio link between St. Peter's and Sable Island. And the first group that went out to investigate that and to install some antennas was a group led by Dick Grantham, VE1 Alpha India from Halifax, Harley Grimmer, VE1 Mike X-ray from Halifax, and Don Bauer, VE1 Alpha Mike Charlie. And of course, these were all telephone company employees, all radio amateurs, and all very keen in knowing that Sable Island had recently been declared as a separate DXCC country. So there was this movement afoot to establish an expedition to Sable Island. And in fact, just as a little backstory, as I've told some of you already, I actually started my engineering undergraduate education at UNB. And at the beginning of my second year, I got busted up playing flag football. Spent the next 4 months in the Everett Chalmers Hospital up on the hill. And then and my folks were living in Moncton at the time. So I remember Dad loading me into a DOT station wagon and taking me from the hospital in Fredericton to Moncton. And I think there was a group of 3 men who had to take me in this body cast and laid me out flat in the little bed next to a radio that Dad had set up for me. So that was sort of the transition. And of course, by the time I was able to get back around again and walk a couple of years later, my folks had transferred from Moncton to Dartmouth, Dad was with Transport Canada and moved to the Canadian Coast Guard side of things. And so when I got ready to go back to school, I approached St. Mary's because on the first expedition to Sable Island, I had been working for a little bit with L&R Towers in Oakville, Ontario, and Dick Grantham knew of my tower climbing capabilities, and he asked me to join the group going out to Sable Island. So in the fall of 1979, Harley, Dick, Don, and myself made the trip out to Sable Island, and I was the monkey to do all the tower climbing, and the rest of the guys operated the ham radio. So that's how it all started. And in fact, over the next 10 years or so, I had made a number of trips out to Sable Island, and I have some photos of those experiences. So moving along, let's see, I'll go to the next slide. So to give you an idea of Sable Island, so the general geography to tell you how things are set up is as follows. So for many years, there was, here at West Bar, there's a lot of shipwrecks that had run aground on the bars, and you could walk down along the bar and you'd see lots of old shipwrecks and stuff, and I used to grab lots of stuff. There were two lighthouses. More recently, they were automated. There's one at Westlake and one at Eastlake. The station at Westlake, the old tower, in fact, was taken over by Father Bill Lonc, a physics professor at St. Mary's University in about 1977. Father Bill was particularly interested in radio physics and tropospheric propagation between the mainland and Halifax and Sable Island, and he had a number of little experiments going on. So when I first got wind of Father Bill's work when I went out in November '79, and then when he knew that there was a young guy out there climbing towers, he asked if we could do a little work for him as well, and I did. And then that Christmas, I went to St. Mary's and rejoined the engineering program at St. Mary's, and he had me working part-time almost immediately doing some of his stuff. And a lot of that was at Westlake. So when we went in '79, most of the activity at the time was at Westlake. And just to give you a perspective, it's about 0.7 of a mile from the weather station, the upper air station, and Westlake. And I have some pictures there. The way we would get to the island, for the most part, well, I had taken a couple of trips on Canadian Coast Guard ships. I remember the Sir William Alexander was one. And so we went there, and there's a couple of trips where it was absolute pea soup fog. And we would take a landing craft, and the ships would be up here. We land on the South Beach. And at the bosun on the landing craft would get his directions from the bridge, because they were steering us using the ship's radar to make sure that we weren't heading out to sea. We were actually heading towards the island. So that was an interesting thing. But in other situations, when the weather was clearer, there was a little airplane, a Brit-Norman Islander, that actually would fly from the Halifax airport and would land on the beach at Sable Island, generally on the outside berm here on the outside of Wallace Lake. And they had a little Ford Bronco out there on the island, and the officer in charge of the weather station would actually run up and down on the beach to make sure that it was sufficiently solid for the aircraft to land. He would call on VHF air-ground radio and tell the pilot it was ready. He would put up the windsock, and the pilot would come in and land. During those days, for the time that I flew out there was a fellow by the name of Bob Laidler, ex-Canadian Forces pilot, who actually flew off the Bonaventure. And what amazed me quite often is when the weather sort of socked in with fog, he would fly towards the Sable Island non-directional beacon, which was at 374 kilohertz. And he would fly towards the beacon. And as soon as the ADF on the aircraft flipped 180 degrees, he knew he had flown directly over the beacon. And he would drop down to about 100 feet, and he would start looking for the people on the ground from like 100 feet. And when he saw it, he would do a little loop around, and he would land right there by the truck. Talk about cowboy piloting, but he was a pretty good pilot. So that's the general layout of the island, and the radio activities where I had my little station set up was here at Westlake. lots of old construction materials and whatnot. So I would take my little Century 21 CW rig out there and the Keyer, which I still use. I would build up antennas for all bands using just materials on hand, string the dipoles up off the tower that you'll see a picture of. I had a 16-foot piece of aluminum pipe for a 20-meter vertical that I stuck on a Coke bottle in the sand dune. I strung up some radios, and I probably made about 3,000 QSOs using about 40 watts and a Century 21. And sat there, and I had pileups going day and night with that little radio. It was absolutely fantastic. So let's see. Okay, so here's an aerial view of Sable Island looking west. And a lot of these I had taken with old cameras, and I just scanned them in. So to give you an idea, so here's Westlake down on this edge down here. That's the ocean on the south side. Westlake is in here. Here's the upper air station right in here, as you can probably see it. And Westlake is coming probably up over in this, right over in this corner. So to give you a bit of a layout of what the station actually looks like. So for many years, the officer in charge of the weather station lived in this little multi-story bungalow thing right here. In the basement of that building was like a crew station. And then more recently, then they actually built another building here that was the new officer in charge bungalow here. And the weather station is over here. So all the surface observations were done in this lower building. And the radio sound L-band tracking antenna was in this dome right here. They would launch the weather balloons from these two buildings here. Well, actually, I think this one here is a hydrogen shed. So they would chemically generate hydrogen to fill the weather balloons. And then they would launch the weather balloon from this building here. And this building down here was the combination grocery stores and garage. And just to give you a little brief story on this. Oh, and this is the new crew quarters over on this side. So this was the old crew quarters. This was the new crew quarters. This was the new officer in charge building. This was the operations building. There was a little LF vertical in behind here. And this was the balloon launch and the hydrogen shed and the sort of workshop down over here. And for many years, they actually had electric generators. And I think this is the generator building over here. And then the diesel tanks for the diesel fuel to run the generators was in this tank back over, this section back over here. So in 1982, when the Rowan Gorilla was sunk off the coast of Newfoundland, that hurricane was actually recorded on Sable Island. It was the deepest depression, atmospheric depression they'd ever seen. And when the winds came across the island, the two vertically folding end doors on the garage were held by a big, huge beam. The force of the wind was so strong that it actually imploded the doors. The doors actually imploded inwards, and the force of the wind actually peeled the roof off that building. And of course, all the alarms went off and everything. It was an absolute mess. And my friends at the time, the officer in charge of the station was calling and trying to get some help, and I was helping out in any way I can. But that gives you an idea of what the station looks like. And to this day, it's pretty much the same, except now they're using wind power instead of diesel generators to power the island's operation. Here's a closer view of the upper air station, and this is a scan from one of the photos that I took. So again, crew quarters, officer in charge bungalow, the old crew building. You can see in operations building, there's the radio sound dome for the antenna, the balloon launch, the hydrogen shed, a couple of other little bit. There's the garage, the tanks, and the diesel shed room down there. And that's looking towards the west from this direction. And this was, so this was a little map that I had made of Westlake. I didn't have a good picture. So I wanted to give you an idea of my operations there for the 3 or 4 years that I went out summertime and set things up. So that's pointing north. The old mechanics quarters at Westlake was actually a building that housed some of the Alexander Graham Bell family for a while. I don't think Bell himself went, but I think some of his family had spent some time on it in Sable Island, and you can read about that. This was an old sort of Quonset hut, the old crew quarters, which has been since torn down. Back in the early days, there were two equipment buildings side by side here, Quonset huts, and they've been replaced by modern structures. The tower that was put up by the telephone company is here, and I use that essentially to hang all my wire antennas off of. They built a new bungalow for the mechanic that's over on this side. The 374 Sable Island nav beacon was here, and the old. So as I was saying, this is the sort of my operation. The new lighthouse here, the old tower with the antennas on it, and so let's go to the next slide. Oh, and just to give you an idea, so this was my Qsl card that I used for all my Sable Island operations, and this one got returned. It was from UA1DF. They said he was a silent key, so it was returned to me. So this was from operations August 24th, 81. And you can see that I was operating CW, low end of 20 meters, and just cranking out the QSOs one right after the other. And then one of the cards that I got in return, so this card, W9LQI/6, from this guy in California, I worked him on 40 meters on February 23rd, 1982. And so he needed, a lot of people needed that QSL card for DXCC. And of course, this was before the day when they had CY0SAB and all those sorts of things. It was only after the initial sort of flurry of activity that Industry Canada, I guess at the time, decided to establish a special call sign for Sable Island operations. So to give you an idea, so this is the little aircraft, the Britten Norman Islander, that's actually taking off from the beach. You can see here's Wallace Lake in the background. The major portion of the island is there. This is the sandbar that it's taking off of. And you can see is a little 6 or 7 seater overwing aircraft, a real strong little aircraft, great one for going in there. And just a little side story. So on one trip we made out, I think it was in Christmas '82, we were coming back into Halifax, and the weather was really bad coming back into Halifax. Heavy winds, we were almost coming in through a hurricane. And we were coming in on final approach to Halifax, and a wind gust caught the airplane, and the stall indicators actually went off. Bob was flying. We had a full crew of passengers in the back, and Bob would always let me sit in the right-hand side. So as soon as we touched down, Bob yelled at me, "Grab the stick." There was such a high crosswind that Bob by himself could not hold the aircraft straight to go down the runway. So that was a pretty exciting landing at Halifax Airport at that particular time. I don't think I'll ever remember that. And I'm sure that all the passengers in the aircraft would not forget that one either. So that was an interesting thing. Let's see. Next. So here's a picture of the Sable Island. This is the old lighthouse, as you can see. That's the new lighthouse over there. So all of these antennas were radio beacons that Father Bill had organized to have transmit on a periodic basis for his VHF, UHF, and L-band radio propagation experiments. And you can see that we're actually using spatial diversity. All of these antennas were essentially pulled from scrap, and the larger ones were shipped by Coast Guard ship and then carried by landing craft or by helicopter over to the island. I actually installed all of these antennas on that tower. So this one, these two here, that one there and that one there was at 440 megahertz. This little one here is at 1296. The crossed verticals on the top, we had a couple, I think there's one that was vertically polarized, a couple that was cross polarized. I built those antennas from scratch in Halifax, and we actually covered them with fiberglass and then took them out and I mounted them up there. The beacons were essentially installed right on the tower in these waterproof boxes. So that was the VHF beacon right there. We simply ran power up to the beacon. Well, there was power installed for the clearance light, so we just had to take a circuit off that. And then the beacons for the 1296 and the UHF were in an enclosure down on the bottom. But that gives you an idea of sort of what the installation was like through the early to mid 80s there on Sable. So then, as I indicated, the telephone company and Environment Canada were very interested in doing this work at 49 megahertz. So we had a 4-element array, a 4x4 that we actually installed on site, and I put it up on the 160-foot tower that had been installed by the telephone company. And so that's one of the antennas that's installed on the ground. And that's another one. So we're getting it ready to hoist the full thing up into the air. And we actually set up a rig here. I set up a carriage line with a pull line that a rig to come along on the tractor. So this was essentially the carriage line, and then the tension line was down here. And my friends from the weather station would actually operate the PTO. I was up on the tower, and I would catch it when it arrived, swing it around into place, and lock it into place. So I think the next picture, yes. So that's me up there on the tower at 160 feet, ready to receive that antenna array. And you can see that I actually had to sort of navigate the anti-twist mechanisms on the tower there. So that was an interesting exercise, but we got to do it. Okay, it worked out well, and it gives you an idea of how you can work out there. So yeah, I'm at the 90-foot level right there, installing that, and that was the lower of the two antennas. Yeah, so then you can see the lower antenna and the upper antenna with everything all set up like so, and that was sort of the end of the installation. In the 1983-84 time frame, there was some discussion about trying to build your own C-band satellite TV station, and we actually were able to get a solid dish, I think from the telephone company, and I'm not even sure if he's still alive, but at the time, there was a ham by the name, I don't even remember his name, VE1 India Foxtrot, VE1IF. And I think his name was Gord. He had retired. He had a medical condition, and he retired from CBC radio. But as a hobby, he was sort of a UHF microwave enthusiast. And he was building all kinds of little circuits. And he did a lot of work for Father Bill as well. And so we had this thing together. We tried to set up, this was our first attempt to provide satellite entertainment for the Sable Island residents. But within a year, commercial service came and they installed I think it was Telsat put in commercial antennas. Okay, so this is an interesting situation. On July 15th, 1983. Well, let me back up and say that my birthday's on July 14th, and almost every year I would try during that time period, I would try to get out to Sable Island for my birthday. So on this particular day, I actually got out there on July 13th. I would do a little operating for a couple of days. And on the afternoon of July 15th, 1983, I'm preparing dinner for all my friends on the island. We had some steaks brought in. We had a little barbecue thing going. I was using just driftwood to fire the little barbecue I had going. And all of a sudden on the VHF radio, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This was a Cougar helicopter, Super Puma, that was flying a full load of passengers to the oil rig. It had lost its transmission fluid and it had to land immediately. The pilot dumped all the fuel for the aircraft from the aircraft and made a slow and fast approach for Sable Island. And I think he was maybe a mile or so from Sable Island, so he almost did an anti-rotation landing he was able to land safely on the island. And all of a sudden, I had 15 extra guests for dinner that evening. So we were scraping to find some extra food in the storeroom to feed all these people that just showed up for dinner. It was a bit of an exercise. I understand it took a couple of months to get that aircraft sort of repaired and flown off the island again, but they finally got it off there. And I'm glad to say nobody got hurt. We had extra people for dinner, and that was all right. So that was an interesting little story. And to give you an idea, so in the back, we're looking south there. So that's sort of that's the south end of the island towards where my pointer is going. So I think that's, and here's one of my friends. So in fact, my dad's got a picture from the late 1960s. I think he's posed with one of our friends here, the great Sable Island ponies. And they were very friendly. You could walk right up to them. You could feed them carrots. You could pat them on the nose. They were very photogenic, so you could get lots of pictures of them. So that's the local host. So the last slide, of course, I always finish these with a bit of a tribute. So this is my tribute to Father Bill Lonc. Father Lonc was, as I said, a physics professor at St. Mary's, a very avid experimenter, one of the terrific, and he loved to teach first-year physics. One of the great things about Father Bill was he had this uncanny knack for generating these experiments that truly represented principles of physics. One of the great experiments I remember is he showed students how to measure the horizontal component of the Earth's magnetic field using a large loop of wire, a compass, and a battery with an ammeter. So what would happen is you would have the loop open circuited. You would align the compass so it was pointing north, and then you would apply some current to the loop of wire with the compass was sitting sort of in the center of the loop. You increase the current until the compass point deflected 45 degrees. And then you had equal magnitude components of the Earth's magnetic field and the loop magnetic field. And then you could calculate from the current in the loop the magnitude of the horizontal component of the Earth's magnetic field. Father Bill had his domain in the northwest corner of the McNally building at St. Mary's, and you could walk in there and he had all kinds of radio gadgets. And of course, we would always go together to visit Junkie Jim's in Halifax. And I know Dad would remember going to Junkie Jim's, and others may remember Junkie Jim's there until they shut Junkie Jim down because of the PCBs had soaked into the soil around his building. But I understand that Bill actually retired from St. Mary's in about 2006, and then he spent his last days at a home for the Jesuits up in, I think, Pickering, Ontario. But it was a great loss to the community. He was a very active radio amateur and was always happy and willing to explain things. And in fact, my folks and I had Father Bill to dinner at our home a few times. So that was always a great pleasure. I know my mom would say that it was difficult to have dinner with Father Bill because he'd have so many stories that there would be very little food consumed from his plate by the time everybody else was finished. So we were all sitting there waiting for him to finish before we could have dessert. So that was quite a thing. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll stop sharing. And I don't know, Dad might want to say something as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting, the whole spiel, because I remember a lot of it, eh?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So any other questions from anybody?
Yeah, Walter, I understand that the island was populated with people at one point. I don't believe there's anybody out there now. When was the exodus of residents?
Well, I think that probably the families, if you will, probably left in maybe around the middle 60s. And there's another ham, Ernie O'Hara, VE1 Alpha Golf. He and Marge, originally from Newfoundland. Now, Ernie was a radio operator on Sable Island in the 50s. And a couple of his daughters actually wrote a story about their days, I think around 1955 there. And I think that was probably maybe some of the last family inhabitants there. Surely in the 60s, people would mostly, the Weather Service was just looking for single folks to go out there and not to carry too much in the way of families. However, when I was there in the 80s, my friends, the Allisons, had their 2 young children there with them, and they then Heather Allison actually homeschooled the kids. But there was always a bit of a risk. Actually, their little boy at the time was on the tractor one day, and he fell off the fender on the tractor, and he got run over by one of the tractor wheels. And there was quite a panic because they had to call for a medevac out of Halifax to come and take him to the Children's Hospital in Halifax. So after that, and I think that was probably around 1980, 81. So after that situation, I think that the government decided that it wasn't such a good idea to have families and young kids on the island. So that was that. Now, you may be aware that Environment Canada actually shut down their weather station, or supporting their weather station, for a number of years. I think around 2006, maybe to 2010 or 11. And then the federal government decided that Environment Canada should start sponsoring the weather station again. Through all that time, an old friend of mine who I haven't seen in years and years, Jerry Forbes, and he actually would come as a summer student. He was a physics student from the University of Toronto when I was going out there. He later became officer in charge, and he stayed when the island was being operated as sort of an independent, not-for-profit, right? It's just donations were keeping the folks there doing weather observations sort of on their own and taking care of the horses and just maintaining the facility. So, and as I said, I think back in 2012, the federal government started supporting the operation again.
Well, now, was that automatic operation, or was there still a person there? Or?
Oh yeah, they were still doing. They're still taking weather observations, and they're still flying the weather balloon twice a day. Yeah, it's an upper air station, so they launched the radio. There's these little, what they call radio sonde beacons. You've probably seen them in other places.
Oh yeah.
So they were launching radio sondes twice a day from Sable Island, and tracking it, and that with that L-band electromechanical tracker, that dish antenna on the electromechanical mount, that's in that radome that I showed in the other pictures.
So that's 2012. So after that, when was the last person on the island? Is there anybody there now?
Yes, I'm sure they're still there. I haven't checked recently, but I think that the upper air station is still in operation.
I think there are also Parks Canada staff on the island on an ongoing basis, as it's now Sable Island is now partially a national park.
Yeah, correct. Okay, any other questions?
So typically, it's the only reason why families would be there would be in conjunction with the weather station.
Well, yeah, during World War II, of course, there were, and even before that, there were life-saving stations. And this was before the time of aircraft. So Sable Island was a much more isolated, independent community back in those days, right? From even like 1910 or 1912 when they first established the Marconi station there with the old wireless rotary gap transmitter. And so if you read Thomas Riddall's book, the Nymph and the Lamp, you'll read about the early, and I think Thomas Riddall actually was a radio operator around 1910 out on Sable Island. And that book, a somewhat fictionalized account, it was informed by his experience on Sable Island. There's some stories in there where the motor that ran the rotary spark generator, the cooling water from that was actually used for showers. So that's They would they would run up the generator, they would heat the water, they would have their shower, and they would actually send their traffic at the same time.
How would a radio operator get to Sable Island now? And how long would a journey take to Sable Island? How long would it take to get there?
It takes under 2 hours to fly. So even when I went out on many occasions with the Brit-Norman Islander, it would take about 2 hours to fly from Halifax Airport out and land on the beach. And that little airplane, and I think even before the Brit-Norman Islander, and Dad could actually even talk to this, I think there were 2 or 3 small air transport companies over the years that would fly supplies up to the island, and they all would land on the beach, and they would all sort of take off from Halifax Airport. And then as far as sailing, I think that you could probably sail from the mainland to Sable Island in a day. I know on one particular trip we were going out, I think, and I don't remember the name of the vessel, but I know that it was in the September time frame. We were going to sail, we were actually carrying a fuel barge to refuel the tanks for the diesel tanks for winter. And there was a hurricane approaching. So the captain of the Coast Guard ship actually pulled us into one of the ports up on the eastern shore. And we actually stayed in port there for a day waiting for the storm to subside. And then we left the next day from the eastern shore, and it took us about 12 hours, I think, to steam to Sable Island. And of course, the seas were pretty rough even then. I know that I was out on one of the bridge wings looking aft, and you could see the fuel barge would appear for a while, and then it would disappear. And the tow line was like 6 or 7 feet underwater. There was this big wave between the ship and the barge. So it was pretty interesting.
Not for the faint of heart.
No, I think you have to have a little bit of adventure in you to take a trip to Sable Island, even today.
Now, you mentioned hurricanes and about the doors blowing open on the structure there. Were there people there during hurricanes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, wow. My friends, Barry and Heather Allison, Barry was there during that event. And that was like in early February. And I got out about 4 weeks later, and he showed me the barograph, the barometer chart. The atmospheric pressure dropped like 20 millibars. There's this huge spike. It just dropped down and it came back up in a matter of minutes. So during the height of that storm, there was actually a Liberian oil tanker that actually bounced over the east end of the island. It had run aground, but then the huge waves sort of picked it up and moved it continuing on. So it sailed away on its own.
I do have a question there, Walter.
Yes.
In regards to the hydrogen generating plant for the weather station, for the upper air station,
yeah.
Where did they draw their water from?
They have purifiers on the island. For fresh water, and I say the purifiers, but there are a number of slightly brackish lakes and freshwater sources on the island itself. And in fact, a lot of the horses drink the slightly brackish water, but it's not normal salt water, because of course even the horses would not survive with normal salt water. And the inhabitants, the buildings for the inhabitants actually have wells sunk, and the sand actually provides sufficient filtration for the water, so it's reasonably fresh by the time it gets to the middle of the island.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
They actually still have an upper air station at Churchill, Manitoba, and they have a hydrogen generation plant there as well.
Yes,
and
yes.
Do the dual radio sound releases once in the morning, once in the evening.
Yes, yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I think, well, so, and Jerry knows, I I worked at VCS Halifax. I had to about trying something. Okay, I'll have to take a look at that later. But so Jerry knows that I actually, while I was recuperating from my busted leg, and reading The Nymph and the Lamp, I decided that I actually wanted to be a Coast Guard radio operator for a little bit, and I went up and actually took the Marine Radio Operator course at Transport Canada Training Institute up in Cornwall, Ontario, and then spent 6 months at VCS Halifax. So during that time when I was up at Transport Canada Training Institute, of course, we had to do the surface weather observation course as part of our instruction. And I know that I think I heard there were 40 upper air stations worldwide and maybe 5 or 6 in Canada. And so they're all, doing their thing and sending the results to WHO. And so, but I know that a lot of that technology has changed. Even the format for the surface weather observations changed now since I was there. When I was at VCS Halifax, we would take the marine weather reports, every 6 hours you get the climate observations from the ships and then forward them forward to Environment Canada.
Yeah, now a lot of it is point and click on the old laptop.
Yeah. Were you in the weather service?
Negative. I was up in Churchill, Manitoba with Transport Canada for about 15 years at the airport. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So Walter, I actually found you in my log. I took a look in Logbook of the World, and there was a QSO I had with you back in 1981. So,
there you go. Did you get your QSL card?
I don't think I asked for one, and but if you care to upload your log to Logbook of the World, that'd be great. And I have worked a few Sable stations since then. It's been pretty regularly activated over the years, but great that you were on there at the time.
Yeah, I know that log is probably lost somewhere in my stuff back at home in Berwick. I've been looking up for it every once in a while when I get home, but it's sort of in the transition. It's probably gone somewhere by now. So, but I'm glad you still have a record of it.
Walter, did you indicate there was a VHF link to the mainland from Sable directly?
There was back in the day. It's no longer there. They've got a satellite link now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, nothing heard. I just wanted to check this in chat. Let's see. Brent said a few of us, like 20 years ago, led by Kent Ross, had some early discussions about trying to sail there on a sailboat to activate it and make a trip for the whole thing. We started reaching out and learning how to get permission and self-sufficiency needs. We never got very far after that, but it's always something I have wanted to do. It's increasingly difficult now.
It very much, and I'm sure it's even worse now than it was then. But we were quite serious. This is probably in the days before the internet was very advanced as well, so we had to do a lot of book research. We were going to have to. But Kent, knowing his sailboat quite well, knew that there was only going to be a few golden weeks likely in the summer where that big Bermuda high was going to be there and give you a chance to get out there and back without becoming another shipwreck. Yeah. But I've always thought of it ever since. That was a great talk. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad that everybody found it interesting. Yeah, very good. Well, I'll let the club get back to its regular proceedings now, if there's nothing else. And thank everybody for listening and interesting questions. And if anybody has any follow-up, of course, Jerry has my email address, and I think a few of you already have it. So feel free to send me a note, and then we can follow up with anything that people might be interested in.